Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Dame Rosie, and it's a great pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Lady in this debate, particularly as the matters on which I wish to touch very much concern her amendment and some of the other amendments we've had. I hope the House will forgive me if I just start briefly with the opening remarks of the Honourable Member for Birkenhead. I hope he'll forgive me, and I'm sorry if he's not in his place, but I hope he'll forgive me if I say that the words he articulated were ones that I could both fully understand and appreciate. Heaven knows I've heard them often enough from constituents and from people, right-thinking people, who want the best for our country. But they also contained within them simplicities. And those simplicities simply do not match the problems that this House faces in disentangling our relationship from the European Union. This has been an issue that has bedevilled the entire debate on Brexit and Remain, and indeed is one of the reasons why we find ourselves where we are today. Now, I happen to believe that what we did last year was a great and historic error. I can't help it. Nothing that's happened since is going to alter my view. But I also recognise my responsibility as a Member of Parliament to try to give effect to what the public asked for in their response to that referendum. But in doing so, I am certainly not willing to suspend my own judgment, particularly when I have to witness what I see as an extraordinarily painful process of national self-mutilation, which I am required to facilitate. And I can't escape that. That's what I feel, and I'm not going to abandon that because I'm ordered to do so by anybody else. So, with that in mind, I have to say to the Honourable Member for Birkenhead, the Honourable Gentleman, that what he's asking for is the desire, perhaps, of many people in this country, which is to go to bed at night and wake up and find the whole thing is over and done with. But unfortunately, it's not going to be over and done with for a very long time. And the problem we have in this bill, and on which we have to focus, is how we try to take this risky, dangerous, for our economy, for our national security, for our national well-being, difficult and dangerous process to a reasonable outcome. And that's what, just bear with me one moment and I'll give way. And that is the challenge we've got. And in doing that, Parliament cannot simply abdicate its responsibility to the executive. Of course, the executive has to get on with the business of the complex negotiations, but Parliament is entitled to take a check on this at every conceivable stage. But the problem is that as the difficulties have piled up, and frankly, in my view, the difficulties were inevitable, predictable and predicted, the tendency has been, and I have to say this to my honourable friends on the Treasury bench, is that everybody's got more and more brittle, more and more unwilling to listen, more and more persuaded that every suggestion that's being made is in some way a form of treason, and finally culminating, I have to say with the deepest regret, last Friday with a mad amendment, which I shall come back to in a moment, tabled, I believe actually, without any collective decision-making in government at all, and accompanied by, I think, blood-curdling threats that anybody who might stand in its way was in some way betraying the country's destiny and mission. And I'm afraid I'm just not prepared to go along with that. I give way to the Honourable.
I thank the Right Honourable Member for giving way, and can I welcome his amendment that gets rid of the Alice through the looking glass absurdity of different exit days for different purposes. And I was an early signer of all his amendments because they're eminently sensible. The Right Honourable Member for Rushcliffe has already described very entertainingly the reasons for the remarkable metamorphosis of a bill that allowed ministers to name an exit day by regulations or different days into one that names a day and a specific time. It was a sop to the denizens of what he called the rear fourth gallery under the balcony. But has the Right Honourable and Learned Member reflected on what such a fundamental change signals to our partners in the European Union as to how serious we are and how carefully we have thought this crucial process through?
There's no doubt that some of the problems we have are undoubtedly not going to be helpful, I think, in our negotiation. Equally, it's right to say that the more we can have mature, considered and sensible debate in this House, I would have thought the more our ability to negotiate with our EU partners is improved. Now, so far as I'm concerned, I've tabled a number of amendments. And like all amendments, some are multiple choice. You only have to do this in this House. This is how we actually go about looking and examining legislation. Some are probing amendments. Some, in my view, are more important than others. The one highlighted by the honourable gentleman is indeed the fact that the government didn't really explain that it wanted to have multiple exit dates. I wanted to tease out what that was for and to suggest that perhaps one exit date might be better because of the consequences on using Henry VIII powers thereafter. But there might actually even be a justification for doing what the government's doing. So all that needs to be worked through in this legislation. And that's what I've sought to do. And if I may say to my right honourable and honourable friends on the Treasury bench, in the course of the last few weeks, we've had some really sensible, constructive discussions on some of the areas of the amendments which I presented. And I hope very much indeed that we can achieve some degree of consensus, in which case some of these amendments may not be required, whether it's the triage, whether it's the way we treat retained EU law. I don't wish to get diverted into all that. I shall come back to it as this bill goes through. But the trouble is, and I do repeat this, that all this gets marred when you get events like last Friday.
Absolutely.
And you get these extraordinary amendments suddenly magicked out of the blue, which simply don't make any sense at all. And I might add, in a moment, and I might add, the other problem which comes is that when I read the amendments and the consequentials, which I have to say I only saw this morning, one of the consequentials has already been highlighted, seemed to me to in fact totally undermine the purpose of the main amendment, to the point where the conspiracy theorist in me made me think that it was a sort of double deceit, a double bluff, that it was intended in some way to give the impression to some of my honourable friends who really worry about this that they were being offered this tablet of stone of our departure, but in fact it was teasingly capable of being shifted. Now, my honourable friend, the Solicitor General, sent me a text earlier which said I'm mistaken about this, that it wasn't the intention, it was the very reverse. Now, I have to say, Mr. Chairman, that these are one of those matters where I'm not a parliamentary draftsman, and I certainly know that there are two ways, and always different ways, in which you can read a statutory, an amendment to a statute. But I remain of the view that it is very peculiar wording indeed if the intention is to exclude the possibility of playing around with the exit date which is being offered as this talisman. I mean, I did naughtily begin to wonder, I have to say to my honourable friend, the Solicitor General, whether in fact the parliamentary draftsman was so appalled at the folly of what the government was doing that he had sneakily altered clause 383 to try to offer them a lifeline in case they came to regret what they had done. But I'm sure that that's being very unfair to the parliamentary draftsman, who always, I know, does what is requested of him. Or her. Yes, I will give way.
Isn't the tendency of any government, especially when it has a major project on its hands such as this, is always to try and manage the project and manage Parliament? But isn't the sadness, is this what he's discovered over recent weeks? The truth of the matter is that in this House there is a consensus. It embraces all of these benches, it embraces a significant number of the back benches on that side, and actually half the government. I can see at least 3, possibly 4 government ministers sitting on the front bench now who would be signing up to his amendment. Would it not be far more rational for the government simply to calm down about this process and try to establish a consensus that can carry the country forward?
I endorse what the honourable gentleman says, and that's precisely what I wanted to start suggesting to the front bench. It seems to me there are a number of key areas in this debate this afternoon. The first is the recognition, belated but nevertheless I'm grateful for it, that in fact leaving the EU requires statutory authority from this House to make it part of the rule of the law of our land. It's a very important principle. Indeed, I begin to detect that the government also recognises that at some point in future, if we get beyond transition, we will probably need another statute to alter the law of our land for any final agreement that we have with our EU partners. And we're going to have to take it in a measured way, and the government is going to have to accept that Parliament, being sovereign, must, at the end of the day, have the ability to support or reject this. There's no way round it. Now, of course, we can have hypothetical questions about, well, there might be nothing to reject because you might be falling out of the European Union with no agreement. Indeed, yes, but we'll discover that when the time comes. In the meantime, the government should get on with its negotiation. We can carry on scrutinising them about that. And at the end, we want a statute. And that statute, and I think it's been acknowledged by the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Halton Price and Howden, has got to come obviously before we leave. Now, that then brings one to a critical issue in this debate. The best point made by the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Halton Price and Howden, yesterday, when we were questioning him, was that whereas moving into transition is a qualified majority decision, actually getting an extension, for example, to Article 50 requires unanimity. So the government may be living with legitimate anxiety that there could be circumstances where the whole thing running up to the wire, it could be in difficulty implementing by statute. I personally think this seems inherently improbable, because on the face of it, if our partners agree a deal with us, why they should then turn around? I mean, I know they talk about perfidious Albion, and we probably think that they're all sort of garlic eaters, but on the whole, I can't really see why, at the end of the day, if they want to do a deal with us, they should decide to pull the rug from under our feet in such an extraordinary fashion in order to tell us that we can't have an extension to Article 50 for the necessary 2 or 3 months to take through our statutory processes, while, of course, they have to take their processes through the EU Parliament as well. I give way to the...
I'm very grateful for the opportunity given way. Was he alarmed yesterday? I was quite alarmed when I asked the member for Alta Price and Howden, the Secretary of State for Dexu, given the Prime Minister had asked in September for this extension, 6 months after she triggered Article 50, a 2-year extension, he didn't seem to have any clue when the EU 27 might possibly agree. I know a number of the media think this is automatically coming, but there's absolutely no guarantee at present, as we speak, that we will get this extension. Did he find that alarming that the UK might indeed find itself out because of its own actions in March 2020?
There are massive uncertainties in all this, and I don't want to pile the gloom on the Treasury bench. So all I will say is that there are great risks, and I do understand, I want to come back to this central theme, that the government has got an important point on this. But if that is the case, then the proper dialogue that should be taking place between the Treasury bench and the House is how we craft and alter this legislation, both to emphasise the statutory processes that are going to be followed and to make sure that the only circumstances in which they are not followed, and Clause 9 has to be used as an example, is where, in fact, it would be impossible to get an Article 50 extension to enable the statutory process to take place before we go. If we start doing that, then, if I may make the suggestion, we are going to start talking sense in this House, rather than ending up where we've been over the last 3 days, which is talking polemical nonsense. I give way to my right honourable friend.
Very grateful to my right honourable friend. When Czechoslovakia decided to form 2 countries with 2 governments, a very complicated task, it took 6 months planning and it was implemented over a weekend. Why does my right honourable friend think that 16 months that remains is not enough to reach an agreement, or to reach the sad conclusion that an agreement is not possible in the mutual interests of both sides, and do all that in an orderly way? Surely 16 months is more than enough time to sort this out.
I can't help the fact, Mr. Chairman, that the reality is that we entered into a partnership which now includes 27 other member states. And, you can't just magic that away. They all have their interests, and they're all going to have to be taken into consideration at the end. And as we've seen with trade agreements that are reached with the EU and other states, they take time. Indeed, I have to say to my right honourable friend that I think that he and some of my friends on this side of the House are frankly delusional in the belief of the speed with which these wonderful new trade agreements are going to be concluded with third countries once we leave the EU. The main anxiety I have on that topic is that there are 759 external treaties which come through our membership of the EU, which we are in danger of losing by the Amendment 381 tabled by the government in respect of putting a written stone date on when we have to leave. And that's what should be worrying us just as much as any other aspect of leaving the EU. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful for him giving way on that specific point. Isn't the real ludicrousness of Amendment 381 is that it's unenforceable and there is no punishment if that law is actually broken? As a former Attorney General, could he just say, what is the point of having a law for which, if the date is extended or broken, there is absolutely no consequence? The minister will not be sent to prison for breaking it. It is a worthless political gesture.
I hope the honourable gentleman will forgive me, but I don't think I entirely agree with him. If this stays on the statute book, then the consequence is that at 11 p.m. on the 29th of March, even though the agreements and transitional arrangements and everything else haven't been worked out, we would drop out of the EU, potentially into the void which so much of this legislation is apparently designed to prevent. And all the benefits or possible benefits of continuing in transition would not be available. So I do think it actually matters very much indeed. And so that brings me really, and I don't want to take up the House's time, to this famous or infamous Amendment 381. Sprung on the House, sprung on the Conservative Party, certainly sprung on me after weeks of talking gently to my ministerial colleagues and trying to find a sensible way through, which I continue to want to do, and suddenly landed on us as a diktat. It is quite simply unacceptable, because what it does is to fetter the government's own ability to carry out this negotiation, which makes me seriously question the government's competence, disenfranchises the House from exercising its scrutiny role properly, with the potential that in fact is almost an invitation to running into the buffers. And whilst I don't happen to believe this is what the government wants to do, certainly does appear to play into the hands of those who seem to be so eager that we should leave the EU with absolutely no agreement whatsoever. I mean, I seriously worry that I go to audiences of the kind that seem to extol the virtues of some of my colleagues on this side of the House, and I'm told that only a departure from the EU without any agreement at all can detoxify us of the taint of our participation. The very words that were used to me actually at the Conservative Party conference. Now, all I can say is I think the individuals who are saying these things are utterly misguided, do not understand how a parliamentary democracy works, do not understand how an international community operates, and whatever their grievances may be, they are the people to whom we have to sensibly articulate an alternative approach. And so for that reason, what I would urge, I'm really pleased that Amendment 381 doesn't have to be put and cannot be put to the vote this afternoon, because I have to say to my honourable and right honourable friends, I will vote against it. There's absolutely no ifs, no buts, no maybes about this. No arm twisting, nothing that can be done to me in the intervening period. It is unacceptable. It is unacceptable, and I will not vote for it. I will not vote for it if I am the only person to go through the lobby to vote against it. That state wouldn't be. So the sensible thing is for them to go away, have several cups of tea, think again, continue talking to me about all those other sensible things we've been talking about and where we're likely to reach agreement, and just focus for a moment on where I think there is unanimity in this House about how we should proceed. A recognition of the government's problem. I shall go away and try to craft an amendment myself as an alternative to my amendment number 7. See if I can do something which enables the government to have that backstop, but at the same time to ensure that that backstop cannot be used under any other circumstances than Article 50 not being extendable, which is the obvious way of resolving this problem, not these balmy sort of cut-off dates and insistence on some magical formula to which we all have to subscribe and bow down to. I will not do so. The government wants my support. It will have it in spades if we just get on with focusing on how we can carry out this difficult and frankly dangerous task sensibly and in the national interest.